So we're going through this series, Creation to Revelation, for a couple reasons. One is that we're reading the Bible together as a family this year, and as a church family. And if you haven't started that, it's not too late. We have a reading plan actually on the app, and it will remind you every day, lest you forget, which we're prone to do. As Brian mentioned, life is full of distractions, and we can allow things to get in the way. But we're reading through this together. You can get daily notifications to do that, and you can always catch up. And so we're reading through the Bible together, and part of this sermon series is to kind of just give you an idea of what each section. We've divided the Bible into 7 different sections, and we're going to go through each section, and it's going to be a 10,000-foot view. It's going to be a very broad overview, but each week I'm going to lock in on, I mentioned this, Scripture, when I read it, I relate to the people. And it's amazing how over and over and over again, God uses ordinary people to fulfill this extraordinary purpose. He did it then, He continues to do it today. And reading Scripture will help us to see how God revealed Himself to the people in the events that are taking place that we're reading about, but it's one way in which He reveals Himself to us today. And so that's very important. The other thing is that you see, the more you read, the deeper you dive, you see everything points to Jesus. Everything continues to point back to Jesus. And sometimes in some books, that's Leviticus, that's easier to see sometimes than it is in others. But everything continues to point to God's perfect plan and how He fulfills that through His Son, Jesus Christ. So today, we got a lot of ground to cover. So let's not waste any more time, right? We're going to look at some history here, and we're going from Joshua to Esther today. And so just to give you a little bit of a rundown as to what you can look at, and also maybe, I don't know how you read Scripture, and I don't know if one of the ways in which you do that is to relate to the people in those events, but I'm going to give you a person or two that you might look at, that you might relate to, and it may be somebody different, and I'd love to hear about that. So, as we pick up here in Joshua, Joshua picks up where Deuteronomy leaves off. Moses has passed the torch, and Joshua is going to lead the people into the promised land and conquer the promised land. And what I think is interesting about Joshua is, reluctant is probably not the right word, but you'll see that God continues to kind of coach Joshua up. And I guess I can kind of understand that the way that I relate to Joshua is, or one of the ways, you never want to be the guy who follows the guy. You know what I mean? Especially if the guy was Moses. Hello, right? You don't want, how do you follow Moses? And so Joshua has that responsibility to follow Moses as a leader of the people and to conquer the promised land. And he's the guy who follows the guy. You always want to be the guy who follows the guy who followed the guy. And Joshua is that guy. And one of the things God continues to tell Joshua over and over is, do not fear, I am with you. He continues to remind Joshua about that. And then you pick up in Judges. And Judges covers the period of Israel's history between Joshua and the establishment of the monarchy. And what you will see in Judges is this pattern over and over again. When Joshua died, the people turned away from God, and as a result, He handed them over to their enemies. And as a result of that, they would cry out to God. He would appoint a judge to lead them, and they would experience a period of prosperity under that judge. That judge would die, and we'd start all over again. And you're going to see that repeat itself over and over. And there are some interesting judges that God raises up. Samson is a doozy. And when you read Samson, I relate to Samson, particularly the superhuman strength part, but also just how ego can get in our way and drive a wedge between us and God when we start to think of ourselves too highly. Gideon is the reluctant judge who am I? I'm the least in my tribe, and yet God uses him. But Deborah, in Judges chapter 4 and 5, and I'm going to say this, and I'm going to look around. I can't tell you about the tent peg because there are children in here, but you can read this about Deborah and how she was, she calls Barak to lead the people into battle. And he says, I'm not going to go unless you go with me. To me, that speaks volume about how respected she was. And she tells him, that's fine, I will go into battle with you, but you need to understand that you will receive no honor from this. That God will hand Sisera, who was the leader of Jabin's army, that God will hand Sisera into the hands of a woman. And Deborah was powerful and respected and wasn't scared. She wasn't scared. She trusted in God. And then that leads us to Ruth. And the book of Ruth is this short narrative that talks about, surprise, Ruth, and how she's a Moabite woman. And she is fiercely loyal to her mother-in-law, Naomi. Naomi and family moved to Moab because there's a famine, and her husband dies. Her sons have married two Moabite women. Ruth is one of them, and they both die. And so here they all are, and they go back because the famine is over, and Naomi tells her daughters-in-law to go back to Moab, go back to your family. And Ruth said, I'm not leaving you. And she famously tells her that your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And there's a lot going on here in this short narrative. But one of the things that this speaks to is how God, and this is, I don't know if foreshadowing is the right thing to say, but this is part of how God includes outsiders in his plan. We'll talk about that later as we get farther along. But it's an interesting and beautifully written narrative. Then we get into 1 Samuel, and the first 4-ish chapters of 1 Samuel, you read a lot about Eli, and I will tell you, Eli is something. A high priest, and just what you read about him and how his life ends up, it's really pretty sad. But you read about Eli, you read about Samuel's surprise, and you get into Saul and David. We get into the monarchy and how Saul becomes the first king, and you begin that relationship, the contentiousness of that relationship between Saul and David. You'll read how David smites Goliath and how Saul begins the process of ending the competition, I guess, if you will. Then we get into 2 Samuel, and it continues the narrative of Israel's monarchy. It continues to focus on David. You will read about David and Bathsheba, and let's just be honest, how David abused his power. He kind of got full of himself. And anyway, you'll read about that. It also talks about prophets, Elijah and Elisha, and Elijah's encounter with the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel, and that's definitely a memorable event. Then we get into 1 Kings, where we are told about the reign of Solomon and other kings of Israel and Judah. Solomon, toward the end of his kingship, if you will, the people are a little bit upset. He's taxing people. He wants to rebuild the temple, and the burden falls on the people, and they're upset about it. And so Solomon dies, and his son Rehoboam takes over, and people want relief. And Rehoboam, so let me go back just a second. I told you we got a lot of ground to cover. There's no way we can cover all of it. When Solomon comes into power, God asks him, I'll give you anything you want. And Solomon asks for wisdom. And God says, right answer. I'll give you that plus everything else. And Solomon was the wisest king of all time. His son Rehoboam was not, proving sometimes the apple can fall pretty far from the tree. Rehoboam asks the elders, what should I do? His counsel, what should I do? The people are crying out for me to relieve them of this tax and this financial burden. And they advise him to go easy on them, to be gentle with them. He decides not to do that. Instead, he tells them basically, you thought my dad was bad? I'm going to be worse. And that leads to the division of the kingdom into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And we read more about that in 2 Kings. It continues the history of the divided kingdoms. And you're going to read in 2 Kings about, again, Elijah and Elisha. And you're going to read about a king named Ahaz. And the lesson that can be taken away. And on another day, you could do a full lesson on Ahaz. Not today. But Ahaz is a king, and he does evil, and the northern kingdom forms an alliance with Syria, and they're going to attack the southern kingdom, of which he is king, and he gets upset about it. And you have to go into the book of Isaiah, which we're not going to do today, but kind of to understand a little bit about how this all happens and how Isaiah tells him to trust in God and it'll be okay. And instead, he decides to form an alliance with Assyria, which comes back to bite him later, which we can learn a valuable lesson from that. It's a temporary fix. And too often, we are more interested in temporary fixes than long-term solutions. And you're going to find out as you read through the Bible, that's not what God's about. God's about his timing and depending upon him. And Ahaz doesn't do that. And so as a result of that, Assyria exerts influence, and they start to embrace Assyrian culture, which includes Assyrian gods, and they start to replace the true God with those false gods. And then in 1 Chronicles, you're going to read more about David, the Davidic covenant, emphasizing David's passion for bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And then in 2 Chronicles, again, you're going to read about the history of the southern kingdom of Judah, and you're going to read about Hezekiah. And Hezekiah is the son of Ahaz, whom we just talked about. And he decides to come in, and we're going to go back to worshiping God. And the Assyrians don't like that, as you can imagine. And so the Assyrians decide to attack, and Hezekiah prays to God, and not doing the opposite of what his father did. Hezekiah trusts in the Lord, and he is given a miraculous victory. And then we get into Ezra, and this gets us into the Persian Empire. And when we skipped right past Babylon, didn't we? Anyway, so we'll come back to it, I promise. But Persia comes in and overthrows Babylon, and they decide Babylon has taken the Jews, most of the Jews, into captivity. Persia releases them into exile, but gives them permission to go back and rebuild the temple, because that's what they want to do. They want to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And so Nehemiah follows up on that a little bit. Nehemiah is upset. He's a cupbearer for the king, and he hears about Jerusalem and how it's been devastated, and he wants to go back and he wants to rebuild the wall, and he wants to make the city great again. And so the king of Persia permits him to do that. And Nehemiah, again, it's a testament to faith in God and persevering through trying times and setback after setback. And then we get to Esther. And Esther is a marvel. She is, we talk about her and we call her Queen Esther, but let's look at her background. She's one of those Jews that is in exile. She's an orphan. She's raised by her cousin Mordecai. And she's in exile. And then King Xerxes decides, she gets caught up in, I hate to call it a beauty contest, but King Xerxes of Persia is looking for a new wife because Vashti, he wanted to show her off at a banquet, and she wouldn't come out, so he throws a fit and banishes her. You know, that's so Xerxes. Anyway, Esther, he's looking for a new wife, and Esther gets caught up in this contest, and she wins the contest, and she becomes the queen. And then you're going to run into Haman, who is one of kind of Xerxes' right-hand man, and he's waltzing through town one day, and he wants everybody to bow to him. Mordecai doesn't, and he becomes infuriated, and he decides that he just wants to kill all the Jews. And so he deceives King Xerxes into passing this treaty, or whatever you want to call it, passing this law that all the Jews are, because he tricks him into believing that the Jews are a threat to his kingdom. And he knows exactly what to say, and he's very good at deception. And we've talked about how there's a lot of deception that you're going to read about through Scripture, right? And so Xerxes is deceived into doing this. Let me back up just a second, because Mordecai actually discovers a plot to overthrow the king and tells Esther, and Esther tells the king, and the king is elated because, hey, I'm not going to die, and that's pretty good news. And so Esther gives credit to Mordecai, and Mordecai, his name, it's written down in the Chronicles of the king, but he's not rewarded immediately. That leads us to this plot that Haman tricks Xerxes into. And Mordecai has this conversation. The Jews, when they find out about this, obviously they are in anguish. And Mordecai sends word to Esther because we've got somebody on the inside. I failed to mention that she has not told anybody she's a Jew. And so Mordecai, and through a messenger, they send this back and forth in Esther chapter 4, and we'll get to this more in depth in a second, but they go back and forth, and Mordecai tells Esther, you have an opportunity to do something here, and perhaps you were put into this position for just a time as this. And so we use that phrase sometimes. And so Esther, I think that's obviously a phrase that sticks out, but one that I maybe like better is when Esther says, and here's the problem, if she goes into the king uninvited, she could be killed. Because that's Xerxes being Xerxes. And she says this could happen. She understands it. And she says, finally, okay, I'm going to do this. And if I must die, then I must die. And that speaks to her character and her courage and her faith in God. That God can do whatever He wants to do through whomever He wants to do it. And He could spare my life, but if I die, I die. I'm going to do what's right. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So, what she decides to do is throw this banquet. She makes Haman kind of think it's for him, and whatever. He's obviously got a big ego, and as he's leaving, as he hears about the party and he's leaving, he sees Mordecai, and he's infuriated once again, and he decides to have this contraption made, and he's longing for the day when he sees Mordecai dead on it. That'll come back in just a second. So the banquet happens, and Haman's plot to kill the Jews is unveiled, and Xerxes is reminded about Mordecai, and what ends up happening is Haman ends up on the contraption that he had intended for Mordecai in the ultimate irony, right? That's a very broad breakdown of those events. The takeaway from that, and there are a lot of takeaways from this, but I want to go back to that conversation that Mordecai has with Esther, because that's the pivotal moment. And if sometimes when I read Scripture, I see it as a movie, and this would be the moment in which everything turns. This is the moment that everything in this narrative hinges on. This conversation between Esther and Mordecai when she decides she's going to do what she has to do. So in Esther chapter 4, starting in verse 11, all the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king, this is Esther talking, in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his golden scepter. And the king has not called for me for 30 days. So the message is sent back to Mordecai in verse 13, and he sends this reply back to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace that you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this? So Esther in verse 15 sends back this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather all the Jews and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go see the king. And if I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. There's a lot going on here in the book of Esther and in this event that takes place. And when I read through stuff over and over again, I don't know how you do this, but sometimes there's this word or phrase that just jumps out and won't let me go. And there's a lot of quotable stuff in this conversation between Mordecai and Esther, but I want to focus on for just a second. When Mordecai tells Esther, if you keep quiet, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. Now, let's forget for just a second, let's not talk about the you and your relatives will die part, okay? Let's leave that over here. Let's just focus on this concept of the truth that God is going to glorify himself. God is going to bring glory unto himself through whomever he wishes, however he wishes. But that's going to happen. The thing that we can learn perhaps from Esther, and specifically from what Mordecai says here, if Esther's thinking about it, she's left with a choice. If I don't do this, the end result is God's going to deliver the Jews for his glory. So if I don't do this, it's still going to happen. Now, let's forget about the you and your relatives will die part, because that probably had something to do with, that would affect us, our decision, I would think. But this idea that God would use somebody else. One of the things that I think we can learn from this is we all have a kingdom. We all have people. It may not be on as grand a scale as this, but we all have people that depend on us. We all have people who we are in a unique position to help. And too often, and I'm just going to speak for myself, and obviously nobody here has ever done this, but too often, I just wait for somebody else to do it. Because it's going to get done. and I'll just let somebody else do it. And I ultimately shirk the responsibility, the opportunity that God has given me. Jesus spoke about this in Luke chapter 10 when he tells the story of the Good Samaritan and how a priest and a Levite, two people who were in positions to help, unique positions to help, and dare I say, had a responsibility to help this man, decided they would walk around him on the other side and leave that to somebody else. And I wonder how many times daily we are presented with opportunities. We are presented, whether it be an event or a person, there's usually a face on it, where we are presented with opportunities to make a difference, not only an opportunity, but a responsibility, and we decide to walk around on the other side because somebody else will do it. God's going to glorify himself. And yes, if that person isn't taken care of, somebody else will come along and do it. But that's not going to please God. That's not why we have been placed in the position for such a time as this. We all have opportunities, and God does not want us to shirk those opportunities. And if there's one thing, and we can learn many things from Esther, but if there's one thing we need to take away with us today is the fact that, and again, I doubt many of us are going to be in a situation where if we follow through with an opportunity or responsibility that we're going to put our lives in jeopardy like Esther did. But our attitude needs to be, if I die, I die. But whatever God has placed upon me, I'm not going to walk around on the other side and let somebody else do it. I'm going to do what God has given me to do. Let's stand and sing.
I am a sheep and the Lord is my shepherd, watching over my soul to keep guarding over me ever, watching wherever I go. And when the winds blow, he is my shelter, and when I'm lost and alone, he rescues me. And when the lion comes, he is my victory, constantly watching over me. He is constantly watching over me. We are his children and he is our Father, watching over our souls. Great is his love for his sons and his daughters, watching wherever we go. And when the winds blow, he is my shelter, and when I'm lost and alone, he rescues me. And when the lion comes, he is my victory, constantly watching over me. He is constantly watching over me. And when the winds blow, he is my shelter, and when I'm lost and alone, he rescues me. And when the lion comes, he is my victory, constantly watching over me. He is constantly watching over me.